activities like BDSM, say, and you already define them as perversions, the word perversion is a pejorative word. The very word perversion sort of means that you have strayed from the right way. And so if you define them as perversions, and indeed that's going to be my objection to Goldman's own attempt to define perversions in an acceptable way, you're going to be including the evaluative judgments as part of the definition. And in that case, you're not going to be able to make a distinction between those cases where somehow the same activity is one to be praised or valued, and cases where exactly the same activity is one that should be disapproved of. So, if you do that, you beg the question of whether this is good or bad. As we see in a couple of weeks, Kant, like Aquinas, assumes that in some ways that they want to define ahead of time, we should be better than the animals. But in some ways that they've already also defined ahead of time, if something is not common among animals, then it shows that if we do those things, we're worse than the animals. So, so being more like an animal is being degraded, but doing things that even animals don't do is even more degraded. You see how the double standard works here. If as Aquinas thinks, no animals practice homosexuality, well, you could take that in the same spirit as no animals read newspapers. Namely, we're better than the animals. We can read newspapers and have gay sex, right? But no, somehow, some of the things that we do that animals don't do make us lower than the animals, and some of them make us higher than the animals. And which is which? Well, that's totally decided ahead of time without any reference to nature, because by definition, we're holding nature fixed. It's just the value of the ways in which we differ from other animals that vary. I mean, if that point isn't clear, think about the distinction that we make between murder and killing. See? You can discuss the wrongness of killing in different circumstances. And you can accept that sometimes, perhaps, killing might be something that is justified. But if you don't have a word for killing which is neutral as between justified and unjustified killing, if you, for example, are stuck with only the word murder, then you can't raise the question of whether it was good or bad, because murder, by definition, is a crime. It's not called murder if it's not a crime. So if the only word you have is the word murder, you can't even bring up a discussion of when killing might be justified or unjustified. And exactly the same holds of sex. So, given all this question, can we define perversion, as Goldman suggests, in such a way as to deprive the word of its pejorative connotations? See, the idea of a connotation is it's a kind of meaning which is not exactly the same as full-fledged semantic meaning. You can use different words for the same thing. So, philosophers of language would then say that your words have the same reference. Take, for example, sex worker and whore and slut. They presumably are intended to refer to the same actual people. That means to say that their extension, the extension of those terms, is the same. They pick out the same class. Now, that in a word which defines or determines an extension is called the intension of the term. And the intension of the term is, if you like, the criterion or the set of criteria that need to be fulfilled in order for someone to fall under that category. But besides the sense and the reference, there is also the connotation. And the connotation of those three words, the connotations of the three words are very different. If you use the expression sex worker, you're simply saying what these people are doing for a living. You're not expressing any opinion about whether this is good, bad, or indifferent. If you call somebody a whore, then in most cases, you are not only designating them as a certain category of person, but you are actually expressing disapproval at the same time. The third word, slut, is interesting because slut is one of those many words. This happens very often with words that begin as slurs and end up as ways of taking pride in something. The word slut has been, if you like, recuperated so that people are happy to call themselves slut, if only to show that the very connotation of the word, the negative connotation of the word slut, is totally irrational. So, for example, the best book available, the best book I know that's available, although now there are many, many such books, about polyamory, about a lifestyle that admits of non-cheating, non-monogamy. That book is called The Ethical Slut. And The Ethical Slut is clearly a title that is intended to take that word out of that kind of negative connotation. You can be proud to be an ethical slut, because an ethical slut is somebody who demands and proclaims the right to behave in terms of love and sex in ways that other people may disapprove of, but there is absolutely no reason for those people to disapprove of it. And so I'd be happy to call myself a slut. And so people in the polyamorous community very often do describe themselves as sluts. Even, whether they're men or women. So this is an interesting thing that these words go through. But you can see what I have in mind when I say that it's important to try and get a characterization of what is covered at the level of sense and reference when we use a certain word, by trying to rub out the connotations that make it pejorative or meliorative. So, as for the notion of perversion, it does seem essentially itself, in the way it's normally used, something that's tied to a means-end analysis, because both Aquinas and Nagel would say, yeah, but I'm telling you the real function of sex, what it's really about, is that. And so a perversion would be something that doesn't really quite make it. Now, that doesn't mean that it's based on natural law, but it is based on some sort of essentialist thinking and on some notion that we have, a valuative notion of normal sex. So, definitions in general attempt to give necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a term. And so, it follows logically that you can reject a definition in one of two ways. You can find a kind of counterexample in which the supposedly necessary condition is not met, and yet it's clearly something to which the term is applicable. Or, conversely, you can say that a supposedly sufficient condition is met by something that should not actually count as a case of it. Example, masturbation. If Goldman's definition is correct, and the essence of sex is about the search for a certain kind of physical pleasure deriving from skin contact with another person, then masturbation is not sex at all, because it doesn't come under the definition. It doesn't meet the condition, one of the main conditions that is said to be necessary, and yet we regard it as definitely a case of sex. Similarly, if that's supposed to be a sufficient condition for sexual pleasure and desire, then maybe wanting a massage or taking pleasure in the feeling of touching a baby, which can surely be totally non-genital, non-sexual in the ordinary sense of sexual, although people get very confused about this. But normally, anybody who is not completely crazy would recognize that you can have all kinds of incredibly sensual feelings deriving from a baby, but that's not sex. There's a case told in a book by Judith Levine called For Their Own Good or something like that, about the sort of the war on child sex, of an unfortunate woman who became terribly upset because she found that she was getting sexually aroused by suckling her infant. She was so worried about this that she called some sort of helpline. And within minutes, the police arrived and arrested her. Right? That's how crazy people can be when they make such confusions about what is sexual and what is not sexual, because they're not able to make that distinction. Well, on Goldman's definition, you might say that maybe she had a reason, maybe she'd read Goldman and she thought, well, I really want to touch my baby, I really feel good when I touch my baby, and it even arouses me. It's not that I want to have sex with my baby, I want to have the pleasure of touching my baby and holding my baby against my naked skin and feeling my baby at my breast and all of these things. That's not sex. Or, alternatively, maybe it is sex, but it is certainly not the kind of sex that you would want to forbid on the ground that it's a case of pedophilia or anything like that. That's totally ridiculous. Now, another problem is that you might have a desire to have sex which is completely driven by wanting to make $100. So, handing over $100 to a prostitute, that would be a sex act, because you would be doing it in order to further the satisfaction of your desire for sexual contact. And is the prostitute's act a sexual one? Apparently not, because the prostitute is only interested in the $100, gets no particular pleasure from the sexual contact. So on Goldman's definition, no prostitute, or rather not no prostitute, but Many prostitutes never actually even have sex.